The next thing I'm going to talk about is the internal structure of the skull. So on page 126 in your lab manual, you'll see this figure, and so you can refer to this as I go over the different parts of the internal structures of the skull. So when we come over here to the skull, the first place that I want you to be able to see here is this little area here. So this is called the cribriform plate. It's the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. And this little ridge that runs down the center, let me zoom in, the little ridge that runs down the center, that's called the crista galli. And all these little holes in there are called the olfactory foramina. And so the olfactory foramina is where the olfactory nerve actually comes from the nasal cavity up into the brain, so that you can, which forms your first cranial nerve, which is the olfactory nerve, which allows you then to smell. And so here again, you see all the holes are the olfactory foramina, and you have the crista galli. Now as we move down from there, this area here is the sphenoid bone. It runs through the center of the skull. This little wing up here at the top, this is called the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. And this whole area down in here is called the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. And so these little holes here are the optic nerves. So if I follow it through, you see where it came out at? Let me turn it around here. It comes out of the orbit. So we identified that once before, that's the optic nerve there. And so it comes through the eye into the center of the skull, and that's where we have then the optic nerve. Okay, so this is the optic nerve here, as well as this the optic nerve. Now this area from here to here is called the sella turcica, and that is where the pituitary gland sits. So when the brain is filling this space, the pituitary gland sits right on top of that sella turcica. And so if we come over here, here's our lesser wing of the sphenoid, our greater wing, and here is that optic nerve right there. Okay. Now these holes here are not supposed to be there. They've been knocked in. So now when we go and start identifying the different holes, okay, are the foramen. This foramen that sits right there, that's the foramen rotundum. We've already identified the foramen lacerum, and that's your foramen ovale and the foramen spinosum. So we identified them on the other side. Foramen spinosum, foramen ovale, foramen lacerum, and that's the foramen rotundum. And so on this model, where we have a lot of extra holes, we have the foramen rotundum here, the foramen lacerum, this is the foramen ovale, and that little one right there is the foramen spinosum. Of course, our large hole in the center, that is our foramen magnum. And this hole right here is the jugular foramen, which we identified on the other side. So that's the jugular foramen. And on this model, you can see that jugular foramen there as well. Now this hole here, which you see there as well as here, that's the internal acoustic meatus. And on this model, you see it there, that's the internal acoustic meatus. This little hole down here on the bottom, that's the hypoglossal canal, right there. And on this model, you kind of got to work it a little bit. It's back off in there. So that's the hypoglossal canal. And so those are the internal structures that you'll need to be able to identify on the skull.